Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and unauthorized.tv. Tonight I'm going to talk about the culture war. I'm going to talk about the war that never ends. And I'm going to talk about how we accept that, why we have to accept it, and why it can actually be beneficial to us once we get accustomed to it. Now, the painting on the cover there is from the Peninsular War. The Peninsular War was a war that probably shouldn't have even taken place. And I think that we can see some parallels between the Peninsular War, which took place starting around 1809, I believe. And the strange thing about it is that it's a war that began after the conquest had taken place. Now, that's not so uncommon today. When we look at the current Afghan occupation, when we look at what happened in Iraq after the U.S. Army occupied Baghdad and so forth, it's relatively common now for a war to come to a close and then for the occupation to ultimately fail as part of what is later seen to all be the same war. The Vietnam War is another example. But back in the time of the Peninsular War, this concept was relatively new. That wasn't usually how things worked out. In fact, this has become one of my favorite books, not this volume in particular, but this is volume 5, I'm currently reading it now, of A History of the Peninsular War by Charles Oman. This is actually a lovely first edition from 1914. You can see the rest of them up on the shelf. And it's really fascinating for several reasons. One, I don't think that there was ever a war that was better documented and analyzed by more highly qualified people, both on the French side, on the English side, and on the Spanish side. And then to have had the advantage of being summarized by individuals who were already there, like Napier, and by such a fine historical mind as Charles Oman, who had access to amazing documentation in a way that even today very few historians would ever have the kind of access to the sort of information that Oman had, and may never again, because it was a much more literate society then. And so he was able to draw upon everything from diaries of regular soldiers to the complete histories written by a number of the various generals involved. And in addition to that, it was also generally considered to be the first real guerrilla war. Like I was saying before, it was a war that people did not expect to take place. Napoleon had already won. The King of Spain had already been replaced by his brother, who was crowned the King of Spain, King Joseph of Spain. And I don't think anyone really considered that there was any chance of contesting Napoleon's will. At that time, Napoleon had conquered most of the continent of Europe, and he conquered pretty much the rest of it during the early years of the Spanish War. And his armies had been practically undefeated by the very best that the Prussians and the Russians and the very best that could be thrown against him. He defeated them time and time again. And so, what chance did the Spanish have? According to all the military thinkers of the time, none whatsoever. And that is kind of an interesting analogy to where we are today, because people look at the situation and they see the massed power of the social media companies with the banks and the payment processors and all these huge, powerful forces lined up against what? Nothing. Who do we have on our side? We have the Trump administration, which occasionally makes noises, slightly threatening noises about the way that people are being treated. But they're kind of like England. England back in the early 19th century, across the channel, very powerful, able to do whatever it wants on the seas, and yet not necessarily of any help whatsoever to the occupied Spanish. They did send a very small army to Portugal, which, even the commanding general at the time, the Wellesley's predecessor, had no serious hope of being able to defend Portugal. In fact, his primary concern, the thing that he thought about most, was making sure that he could withdraw his troops safely from Portugal when the French came hard against them. In fact, his big accomplishment, and it was a military accomplishment at the time, his big accomplishment was to preserve the southern Spanish forces, the actual Spanish forces, from being fully occupied by King Joseph and the French, when they started marching south from Madrid. He invaded Spain from Portugal, made it look like he was going to go for Madrid, and then ran away. And in the first volume of Oman's history, he talks about the terrible retreat, constantly under attack from the French cavalry, and the way that they retreated back into Portugal, and where they finally got on the ships and managed to successfully escape. But the whole thing was just basically a feint and then a retreat, and that was the best they could do. That was the most they could accomplish. And so it was fascinating to see the way that the French, who looked so undefeatable, who looked so completely in control of the situation, gradually kept losing their ability to control the Spanish. And the important thing was the absolute persistence of the resistance. And that's what I mean when I talk about the war never ends. I was talking to one of the lawyers today who's been involved with our Indiegogo deplatforming, and we've been in a legal dispute now for, let's see, January, February, 6 months. It's been going on for 6 months, and things appear to be reaching a critical point. Maybe it'll be an important nexus. Maybe it'll be just another way station in the process. But we were talking about some other projects that we're working on, and how they'd been deplatformed from our first choice, which actually wasn't our choice. It was not a place we would have chosen. We were not surprised once we did a little more homework on it. But we were talking about how, we've got option A, we've got option B, and possibly option C. And the lawyer said, well, this looks pretty good, but if option B doesn't work, then we go to option C, and if option C doesn't work, we go to option D. And what I liked about his attitude was that it was a marked change from where we were months ago, when we were being surprised by these things, when we were being caught off guard and not entirely prepared by these things. Now, we anticipate it every single time. A lot of people were surprised by the recent YouTube purge, which, remember, is ongoing. They've said that they don't think that they're going to have all the unwanted creators and videos and so forth cleared off YouTube for another 4 or 5 months. So, this is not a one and done thing. This is not a brief blitz like they had with the previous round against Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson. This is something that is going to be ongoing and is going to affect many people. It may well include this channel. But you know what? It doesn't matter. It will make literally no difference to us. We're not even going to miss a beat. And in fact, we're waiting for them to do it. Why? It's a basic martial arts principle. One of the first things I learned from my instructor was the concept of windows. And they would talk about, when you're fighting, there are 4 windows, upper right, upper left, lower right, lower left. And you can block most of them. But what you can't do, what's impossible, is you cannot block and attack at the same time. And so one of the elements of becoming an advanced fighter is not only learning how to effectively attack without leaving yourself too open and too vulnerable, and not only about forcing the opponent to open his windows or lure him into opening his windows. You throw a feint low, he blocks low, that leaves him open high, that sort of thing. But at the most advanced level, the advanced fighter knows that the attack is coming. And so what he does is he waits for the attack, and as soon as it comes, he knows when it comes that a opening will be created. And so he's literally waiting for the attack to come so that he can counterattack at the same time. And that's the philosophy that we are learning to adapt to this current situation. Indiegogo came after us, deplatformed us, and now we're on the attack. Google demonetized Owen. Now we're in the process of looking into that. In the case of my channel, we've been waiting for months, if not years, because we weren't originally paying any attention to YouTube, but we were expecting something with regards to the blog, maybe with Gmail. And this is a mentality that you have to adapt. You know, when the Spanish were first invaded by the French, they were completely in shock. They were totally useless. Their armies ran away, and so forth. But over time, they learned how to resist. And some of the most effective Spanish leaders were not the professional military. They were actually the, I guess we would call them the partisan leaders, the guerrilla leaders, up in the north. And, you know, they very seldom won any pitched battles. But what they did is they tied up an incredible number of resources, hundreds of thousands of troops, that made it impossible for Napoleon's other generals to assemble enough forces to beat Wellesley and the Anglo-Portuguese army. Now, where are our reinforcements coming from? Who's the equivalent of the Anglo-Portuguese? Well, you know, some of the companies that we've been talking to, there's a number of Eastern European, Chinese, and Eastern European companies that are very, very interested in actively coming to the West and competing hard with these converged social media giants. There's a reason why China shut down Facebook. There's a reason why China doesn't want to give Google an entry. And it's not my belief, I know perfectly well, that some of their big equivalents are in the process of moving west. Now, you could argue, I think quite reasonably, that there's a bit of a frying pan fire option here. But frankly, what other choice do we have? If they're going to deplatform us and try to interfere with even our ability to reach out at all, then we have a duty and we have a responsibility to accept whatever allies we can that are fully capable of standing up to them. In fact, this is very similar, again, to the situation in the Peninsular War, because the French could never do anything about the English, because the English were beyond their reach. And in this context, China is beyond the reach of Big Social. They have that great Chinese tech wall behind which they're protected, but from which they can reach out and support allies, make inroads, etc., etc. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this works out over time, because already, whether you're talking about film distribution, whether you're talking about payment processors, whether you're talking about even just middleman merchandising, Alibaba is bigger than Amazon, if I recall correctly. Anything, it's going to be very interesting to see how companies like PayPal and Stripe deal with their competitors who are going to be outside the control of the SWIFT system and so forth. What we're seeing, this crackdown, is not going to be successful. And maybe it's just something that they're trying to do for the 2020 election, which isn't going to make any difference. I mean, I said there's going to be a Trump slide back in 2016, in 2020, and I see absolutely no reason to change my opinion in the slightest as we see the debacle of the various Democratic Party candidates. Could Trump be doing better? Absolutely, but he's still been one of the best presidents, one of the best American presidents that we've ever had. And that's going to become more and more apparent to people as the election approaches. Don't get me wrong, I'm just as disappointed as many of you are about his lack of progress on draining the swamp, building the wall, etc., etc. But again, when you look at the alternatives, what is there? So what I want to encourage you to adapt, or what I want to encourage you to adopt, is the understanding that this is the new normal. We can't go back to the world that we've lost. It doesn't exist anymore. And never again can you sign up for a service, whether it's free, whether you pay for it. Never again can you simply sign up and assume that they will respect your business and that you're safe. You always have to be ready to deal with a potential deplatforming, a potential demonetization, a potential deletion of this, that, or the other thing, because that is the new normal. But there's no need to despair. Look at what happened with Oberlin College. Look at what happened with that professor at Southampton. Oberlin tried to gin up an SJW outrage posse against, I believe it was it's either a bakery or a pizza shop or something. They just got hit for $11 million in damages. In Southampton, this Christian economist, he's actually the guy who created the term quantitative easing. He coined the term quantitative easing. We're not talking about some minor trivial intellect here. We're talking about somebody who's actually pretty well regarded. He was discriminated against because he's a Christian, and they just awarded him £2.5 million. And so the war has just begun. If we are to compare it to the Peninsular War, we're still in 1809. Most of the people on our side haven't even begun to understand that they need to fight yet, much less how to fight. They're not even necessarily aware that a war is on. But we are. And you are. And that's why it's so great and it's so important that you are supporting Unauthorized, that you're supporting Owen, that you're supporting me, that you're supporting various other creators that you follow. We're going to win, but it's going to take time. It's going to take a while. And the single most important thing is persistence. So keep your morale up. Don't let yourself give in to despair. Don't black pill yourself, and don't let anyone else do it to you either. We know that even a bunch of uneducated, barely armed, barely clothed peasants can defeat the most formidable military force commanded by the foremost military genius of his time. We're up against morons. This is not the Google A-team. Twitter is not the most formidable intellects out there. Mark Zuckerberg is little more than a thief. the people that we're up against didn't even build the platforms that they're currently in control of. And so they'll do what they do. They're going to deplatform more people. They're going to demonetize more people. They're going to delete more videos. They're going to suspend more people from Twitter. It doesn't matter. We have alternatives coming. Others have alternatives coming. Social Galactic, I think we're going to be releasing it sometime this summer, if I understand correctly. Unauthorized is growing rapidly, both in terms of subscribers and in terms of the number of views and minutes and so forth. And when there are bumps in the road, and there will be, don't worry about it. We're not worried. We're waiting to counterattack. And so, just like with Gamergate, in Gamergate we had a saying, the ride never ends. And that was very important to keeping everybody's morale up, because everybody understood that this wasn't something that was going to end tomorrow. There were times in the past few years that I would think, oh, I can't wait for this to be over, and then I can relax and get back to writing this or writing that, whatever. Now I know that's not an option. It's never going to end. So I just have to account for that, plan for that, and find the time to write those books and do those other things while we're dealing with all these various issues. It's okay. Once you get accustomed to it, it energizes you. When I talk to my guys that are involved in the various aspects of this, they're fired up. When I talk to Owen, he's constantly wanting to push forward on multiple fronts. And so just keep it in mind. A culture war like this isn't going to be settled by an election. It's not going to be settled by one conclusive metaphorical battle. It is simply going to go on and on and on and on. And it's existential in nature. The enemy wants to destroy who you are. And that's why you just have to realize this is what we do now. This is part of who we are. And, I'd encourage you to not just accept it, but embrace it. We don't need numbers. We have surprisingly good numbers as it happens, but we don't need it because we have the truth on our side. And reality always wins in the end. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all of you who have subscribed to Unauthorized in the past 3 days. It's been incredible. We'll be bringing some new stuff to you soon. I'm actually a little frustrated because there's a new documentary I've got for the subscribers that for some reason it just won't process properly. So we're working on that tomorrow. Or we'll be working on that on Monday. But in the meantime, have a good weekend. This is the Darkstream. I'm Vox Day.